So why don't you believe that Jesus is the Messiah? I said, look, why do you believe? I said, what is the Messiah meant to do? Well, if you look in the books of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, you look through the prophets and the writings, they tell us a few things that's meant to happen. Number one, he's meant to bring universal peace. Universal peace. Nation shall not raise sword against nation. They shall not teach war anymore. Does this sound familiar to you? Certainly it doesn't sound familiar to me from the media, because when I look in the newspapers and listen to the news, I don't hear much of universal peace around the place.
The Christian response is obviously that of the millennial reign of Christ. At the return of Christ, at the Battle of Armageddon, does he afterward establish this universal worldwide peace? We'll get into this as we go along. Revelation 20 states that Satan will be cast into hell. So Revelation even gives us details about particular parts of this peace. Satan will not even be present on the earth during this time. That's how peaceful the earth is going to be. Satan will be cast into hell for 1,000 years, and the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ, will reign over all the earth.
I said, number two, there's meant to be, it says, as the verse says, and people will know God. The knowledge of God will cover the earth like the ocean covers, the sea covers the ocean floor. Universal acknowledgement, knowledge of God.
And once again, to this, I would point to the millennial reign of Christ, whenever he rules over the entire world. In Zechariah 14:9, the Old Testament, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one. Once again, what does Revelation 20 verse 4 tell us? And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. Speaking of us reigning with Christ during that time. And they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years, speaking of the Lord ruling over the whole earth. I would also like to add to this that of a recent article ranking the 25 most influential people of all time. And on this you have Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, but who ranks number one? The very same person in whom almost always ranks number one in the most influential of all time, Jesus. And just to add to that, what is the best-selling book of all time? According to Guinness World Records, as of 1995, the Bible is the best-selling book of all time with an estimated 5 billion copies sold and distributed. So the most popular book in the world is that of the Bible, which includes Old and New Testament. And the most famous person to have ever lived is that of Jesus. So I would argue that the name of the Lord is already spreading vastly. But in Philippians 2:9 and 10, we also read, Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of things in heaven, and things in earth, and things under the earth. So if you want to talk about popularity, one day even people in hell are going to bow to Christ, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
Number three, the Jews will come back to Israel. I will bring them back to this land. I will increase them, and I will give them prosperity beyond that of their forefathers in this land, so ingathering of the exiles.
Now we're getting to the meat of the matter. In Isaiah 11:11, we read one of the parts of the Old Testament where this is prophesied, And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. Now, if you take that verse out of context, you're going to look at that and say, well, that's talking about recovering them after the Babylonian captivity. Let's back up one verse. In verse 10 we read, And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse, which shall stand for an ensign of the people. To it shall the Gentiles seek, and his rest shall be glorious. Remember what Jesus says, Come unto me, all ye that are labored and heavy laden, and I shall give ye rest. But now go to the verse right after 11. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble for the outcast of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Now this is talking about bringing them back into the land. Old Testament, Now let's look to what Jesus says in the New. Surely you all remember in Matthew 24 how his disciples asked him what will be the signs of the end of the world. In other words, right before his second coming. They didn't know that at the time, but Jesus, he alludes to that all throughout. And he goes on to tell them about, well, there'll be wars, rumors of wars. He begins to tell them about the final 7 years of tribulation. And he says, watch out for false Christ, false prophets, false miracles, the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. He then goes on to tell about the great tribulation, and then he winds up with this: immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And I got to thinking whenever I was reading this about how terrifying that moment's going to be for those on the earth, because we're all preparing to come back down at that moment, and it's all going to get really, really dark at the Battle of Armageddon. And then suddenly this enormous light right above Jerusalem is going to appear, and like just a huge bolt of lightning, Christ is going to strike the Mount of Olives. It's going to split in half for a valley, and the Jews will be able to escape through there while he is destroying the Antichrist and his army. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now notice, a lot of people, like myself a few years ago, they take this to mean, in context, they say, well, this is talking about the rapture. Notice the words right here. And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. This is his second coming. It even says this is when he's coming back. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And this is whenever not only the Jews will be brought back to Jerusalem for safety, but also the believing Gentiles, that of all the elect will come back. And Jesus is given a lot more details for these prophecies in which the Jews would know according to the Old Testament prophets. And he's saying that he'll send his angels out to gather them back in. So in answer to the rabbi's question, this will also take place at the second coming.
So you're a Jew, right? It's right after, it's 70 of the Common Era. The Roman stones, ballistic stones lying all over the streets of Jerusalem. The temple is destroyed, it's in flames. The Jews are in exile all over the world. Paganism has taken over in much of the world. And the temple is destroyed, and the Jewish people are in exile. And someone comes to you and says, listen folks, I've got good news. I say, what's the good news? He says, the Messiah's here. I said, really? Could have fooled me.
Now, of course, the rabbi is alluding to the siege of Jerusalem by Titus 40 years after Jesus, and how they destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed the second temple, and they even changed the name, which we're about to come to, of Israel to Palestine. Jesus Christ himself, though, even prophesied concerning the destruction of the second temple in Jerusalem. Once again, let's go back to Matthew 24:1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. They were like, look at how lovely all of this is, because Herod the Great had really added so much to the second temple by that time. And Jesus said unto them, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. This prophecy would be literally fulfilled 40 years later during the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 AD. The destruction of 70 AD was far more detrimental to the Jewish people than the Babylonian captivity some 600 years before, whenever the first temple was destroyed, in that even the very name of the land was changed from Israel to Palestine. Also, not only was the name changed, and this all occurred because they rejected their Messiah. But it was also worse in the sense that after the Babylonian captivity, the Jewish people were able to come back into Israel, into Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple in under 100 years' time after they were first taken into captivity. Since the destruction of 70 AD, they have not, and it's almost been 2,000 years since that time, they still have not got another temple. But back to the rabbi's conundrum in that if the Messiah, and he's saying that the exact opposite happened during the time of Christ. He says, now wait a minute, if Jesus was the Messiah, then we should not only have the temple, but we should also be ruling over the world and have complete dominance, and a paradise should be set up, no more wars and all of this. The exact opposite happened with 70 AD. Well, after telling his disciples, after Jesus told his disciples of the destruction of the temple, after he prophesied it, they then went on to ask of him concerning the end of the world itself. And just as noted earlier, Jesus replies by telling them of the horrific events that will precede his second coming: wars, false Christ, abomination of desolation, etc. He then goes on in verse 32 of Matthew 24, and he says this, now pay close attention. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. Now pay close attention to this. The parable of the fig tree. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the door. Now, of course, he is speaking in the figurative sense, in that whenever you begin to see these false Christ and these false miracles and all of these wars and everything that he's just told about, whenever you begin to see these things, then you'll know that the end is near and his second coming is arriving. But also notice the specific mention of the fig tree in passages like Jeremiah 24 and Hosea 9. Figs or fig trees are used as a representation of Israel. And once again, what does he say? Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. Now isn't it something how ever since 70 AD, the nation of Israel did no longer exist. It was known as Palestine up until 1948, whenever the nations actually felt sorry for the Jewish people for just a moment, because Hitler tried to annihilate them, and they suddenly gave them back their land, the state of Israel, born in May of 1948. So perhaps that has something to do with this fig tree parable and putting forth of the leaves?
Right? If the Messiah is here, we should not be seeing wars all over the world as we are seeing. If the Messiah is here, all the Jews should be in Israel. If the Messiah is here, everyone in the world should have a relationship with God. If the Messiah is here, then we should see a King David. We shouldn't have some WASP, white Ashkenazi socialist paratrooper ruling Israel. It should be some member of the House of David, right? It should be a different world.
And once again, it will be whenever the Messiah returns. One of the major problems with reading Old Testament prophecies without the New Testament context concerning the Messiah is that people only acknowledge part of them. Quickly notice how the rabbi mentions wars and terrible things still taking place in the world, and this is probably his most major argument against Jesus as the Messiah. But just as Christ prophesied would happen before his return. Yes, the Messiah is to be king of the world and establish his kingdom in Jerusalem, but he is also prophesied to be a suffering servant. Isaiah 53, who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Talking about whenever he's on the cross, they believe that it was God punishing him, whenever truly he bore our griefs. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. How in the world do you gather that anywhere outside of Christ's actions? Who else fits this more than anybody? He shall bear their iniquities. Christ is the only one to have ever claimed to do so. Psalm 22:16, for dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. Now tell me, when did David, in whom wrote Psalm 22, when did King David ever have his hands and feet pierced? This is clearly prophetic, speaking of the crucifixion. Zechariah 12:10, and I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications, and they shall, now pay close attention to this, and they shall look upon me, this is God speaking, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. This is God speaking in both the first and the third person. He says, they'll look upon me, and then they'll look upon him. Obviously, this is speaking of the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God.
Therefore, I believe in the Torah, right? I'm still believing in the Torah, as do most Jews through thousands of years. This, to me, is not a major question. Thank you.
And to this, I would reply that if you so believe the Torah, then why not believe such verses as Isaiah 9:6? For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, speaking of this child that's born, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And what does the New Testament tell us of Christ? In John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And finally, though the rabbi didn't mention this portion of prophecy, I'm going to bring it up. In Isaiah 35, we read, say to them that are of a fearful heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, even God with a recompense. He will come and save you, speaking of the second coming of Christ. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert. Now all of these miracles, the sight of the blind restored, ears opened, such miracles truly narrow the window on who this Messiah could be. We know that Jesus did all of those things whenever he first appeared in Jerusalem, in Israel. He healed the blind, he healed the sick, he even brought people back from the dead. So I would ask all of you, my friends, who else fits the description of the Messiah better than Jesus Christ?